Hi guys, so we're going to start Act 2, Scene 3. So you need to turn to page 62 of your No Fear Shakespeare books. And we're going to start with a porter scene. So a porter is a person who would have been in charge of the door of a castle. And so we're going to see the porter of Inverness Castle. And he is going to be playing a bit of make-believe. He's going to be pretending that he's actually at the door to hell and that the person knocking on the other side is a different spirit each time. So this scene can be quite confusing. Another important thing to note is that the porter is incredibly drunk. And basically this scene is meant to be funny, and it would have been intended to be funny for Shakespeare's audience. It's a little bit of an intermission. So I assume, and many people assume, that this part of the scene would have been put in place to allow the actors playing Macbeth and Lady Macbeth to change and wash the fake blood of Duncan's murder off of them. So keep that in mind when you look at this scene. Now I want you to write a summary at the top of this page. Again, you can wait till the end of the scene and then come back and write the summary, or you can copy mine down. So this is what I've written. A porter is awakened by Macduff and Lennox knocking. Macbeth greets them at the gate. Macduff checks on Duncan and cries out his murder. They blame it on the guards, who Macbeth claims he quickly killed. Okay, so that's a summary of this scene. Another important thing to note, and it's very subtle and easy to miss, is that they wonder why the guards killed Duncan, and Macduff comes up with the theory that Malcolm and Donalbain, Duncan's sons, paid the guards to kill their father. And that's not really revealed until the final scene, scene 4 of this act. Okay, so let's get into the characters. This image will represent the drunk porter. Lennox will return in this scene. This picture will represent Macduff. Use this picture of Macbeth to show he's washed off the blood. This picture will show Lady Macbeth after having wiped the blood on the guards. This picture will represent Malcolm, Duncan's oldest son and heir to the throne. This picture will represent his younger son, Donalbain. Lastly, there are parts in this scene where all the characters speak together, and when they do, I'll be using this graphic. This scene begins at the south entry to Inverness Castle, where we heard the knocking in the previous scene. Porter, who is obviously drunk, enters. "Here's a knocking indeed. If a man were a porter of Hellgate, he should have an old turning the key." "Knock, knock, knock. Who's there in the name of Beelzebub? Here's a farmer that hanged himself on the expectation of plenty. Come in time, have napkins enough about you. Here you'll sweat for it." "Knock, knock, knock. Who's there? Faith, here's an English tailor come hither for stealing out a French hose. Come in, tailor. Here you might roast your goose." "Knock, knock. Never at quiet. What are you? But this place is too cold for hell. I'll devil porter it no further. I had thought to have let in some of all professions that go in the primrose way to the everlasting bonfire." Anon, anon. I pray you, remember the porter." The porter opens the gate, and Lennox and Macduff enter. "Was it so late, friend, ere you went to bed, that you do lie so late?" "Faith, sir, we were carousing till the second clock, and drink, sir, is a great provoker of 3 things. "What 3 things does drink especially provoke?" "Marry, sir, nose painting, sleep, and urine. Lechery, sir, it provokes and unprovokes. It provokes the desire, but it takes away the performance. Therefore, much drink may be said to be an equivocator with lechery. It makes him,
and it mars him. It sets him on, and it takes him off. It persuades him and disheartens him, makes him stand to and not stand to. In conclusion, equivocates him in a sleep, and giving him the lie, leaves him. I believe drink gave thee the lie last night. That it did, sir, i' the very throat on me, but I requested him for his lie, and I think, being too strong for him, though he took up my leg sometime, yet I bade a shift to cast him.
Is thy master stirring? Enter Macbeth in his nightgown and clean of blood.
Knocking has awakened him. Here he comes. Good morrow, noble sir. Good morrow both.
Is the king stirring, worthy Thane?
Not yet.
He did command me to call timely on him. I have almost slipped the hour.
I'll bring you to him.
I know this is a joyful trouble to you, but yet 'tis one.
The labour we delight in physics pain. This is the door.
I'll make so bold to call, for 'tis my limited service. Macduff leaves to go check on Duncan, leaving Lennox alone with Macbeth.
Goes the king hence today?
He does. He did appoint so.
The night has been unruly. Where we lay, our chimneys were blown down, and, as they say, lamentings heard i' the air, strange screams of death, and prophesying, with accents terrible, of dire combustion and confused events, new hatched to the woeful time. The obscure bird clamoured the livelong night. Some say the earth was feverish and did shake.
'Twas a rough night.
My young remembrance cannot parallel a fellow to it. Oh, horror, horror, horror! Tongue nor heart cannot conceive nor name thee.
What's the matter?
Confusion now hath made his masterpiece. Most sacrilegious murder hath broke ope the Lord's anointed temple, and stole thence the life of the building.
What is't you say? The life?
Mean you his majesty? Approach the chamber and destroy your sight with new Gorgon. Do not bid me speak. See, and then speak yourselves.
Exeunt Macbeth and Lennox.
Awake! Awake! Ring the alarum bell! Murder and treason! Banquo and Donalbain! Malcolm! Awake! Shake off this downy sleep! Death's counterfeit, and look on death itself! Up! Up! And see the great doom's image! Malcolm! Banquo! As from your graves rise up, and walk the spirits, the countenances, this horror! Ring the bell!
Enter Lady Macbeth. What's the business that such a hideous trumpet calls to parley the sleepers of the house? Speak, speak.
O gentle lady, 'tis not for you to hear what I can speak. The repetition in a woman's ear would murder as it fell.
Enter Banquo.
O Banquo, Banquo, our royal master's murdered.
Woe, alas, what, in our house?
Too cruel anywhere. Dear Duff, I prithee, contradict thyself, and say it is not so.
Enter Malcolm and Donalbain. What is amiss?
You are, and do not know it. The spring, the head, the fountain of your blood is stopped. The very source of it is stopped. The royal father's murdered. Oh, by whom? Those of his royal chamber, as it seemed, had done it. Their hands and faces were all badged with blood. So were their daggers, which unwiped were found upon their pillows. They stared and were distracted. No man's life was to be trusted with them. Oh, yet do I repent me of my fury, that I did kill them. Wherefore did you so? Who can be wise, amazed, temperate, and furious, loyal and neutral, in a moment? No man. The expedition of my violent love outrun the pauser. Reason. Here lay Duncan.
his silver skin laced with his golden blood, and his gashed stabs looked like a breach in nature, for ruin's wasteful entrance. There the murderers, steeped in the colours of their trade, their daggers unmannily breached with gore. Who could refrain, that had a heart to love, and in that heart courage to make love's known? Help me hence, oh! Look to the lady! Malcolm aside to Donalbain. Why do we hold our tongues, that most may claim this argument for ours? Donalbain to Malcolm. What should be spoken here, where our fate, hid in an auger hole, may rush and seize us? Let's away, our tears are not yet brewed. Malcolm to Donalbain. Nor our strong sorrow upon the foot of motion. Look to the lady! Lady Macbeth faints and is carried out. And when we have our naked frailties hid, that suffer in exposure, let us meet and question this most bloody piece of work. To know it further, fears and scruples shake us. In the great hand of God I stand, and thence against the undivulged pretence I fight of treason's malice. So do I. So all. Let's briefly put on manly readiness and meet i' the hall together. Well contended. Exeunt all but Malcolm and Donalbain. What will you do? Let's not consort with them. To show an unfelt sorrow is an office which the false man does easy. I'll to England. To Ireland I. Our separate fortunes shall keep us both the safer. Where we are, there's daggers in men's smiles. The nearer in blood, the nearer bloody. This murderous shaft that shot hath not yet lighted, and our safest way is to avoid the aim. Therefore to horse, and let us not be dainty of leave-taking, but shift away. There's warrant in that theft, which steals itself when there's no mercy left. Okay, and so we've finished Act 2, Scene 3. So if we turn now to page 62, we'll be able to go through the themes, vocabulary, and imagery of this scene. So we'll begin with the porter and what he's talking about. So he says in the first line, if a man were a porter of Hellgate. So basically he's playing a game in his drunken state where he's thinking himself as the gatekeeper to hell, and he's pretending that the people knocking are different ghosts. So the first thing he says is the name of Beelzebub. So he's saying in the name of the devil, that Beelzebub being another name for the devil, that there's a farmer who's hanged himself. And he says it with the expectation of plenty. So the farmer had expected there to be plenty from his crop, and there wasn't, and so he hanged himself. So that's the first spirit he greets. And then the knocking continues because, of course, the porter hasn't answered the gate. And then he says, in the other devil's name, there's an equivocator who could swear in both the scales against either scale. So basically, there is a man, probably somebody who worked in banking or business, and he had a dodgy scale, and so he was probably killed for not being transparent. And then he says, for God's sake, that's on line 10. That means a smooth talker who get around the truth but couldn't talk his way into heaven. So he's basically saying who committed treason enough for God's sake. So somebody who couldn't get into heaven. So obviously they've come to Hell's Gate. And then they knock within again, and he mentions an English tailor who took out a French hose being a type of tight pants that were fashionable centuries ago. Okay, turning to page 64. We're looking at line 15, and I want you to highlight the line, this place is too cold for hell, I'll devil porter no further. So there is a line that's sort of exemplifying the game that the porter's been playing up until this point. And then he says, remember the porter underneath this. So that's line 19. And he said, and that just means pay heed to the porter, or pay him for doing his job. We'll go down to lines 21, and Macduff says, you do lie so late, So this tells us that it's now morning. So the porter was so drunk and had possibly passed out, and he waited so long playing his game that it's now morning outside, so dawn has broken. And then the porter starts talking about drinking. And he says, "Faith, sir, we were carousing till the second cock." And that's referring to a rooster. Carousing means drinking. And when you hear the second rooster crow, that means it's 3 a.m. So the household at Inverness were drinking until 3 a.m. in the morning. We'll go down to line 25. When the porter says that there are 3 things that drinking provokes, and Macduff asks, what are those 3 things? And the porter says nose painting, which refers to the nose turning red, which especially happens in people with fair skin who have rosacea, so they'll get a red nose and red cheeks when they're drunk. Sleep, which also refers to passing out, and urine, which refers to wetting the bed or needing to go to the toilet. And then he mentions lechery, and lechery here means usually a masculine type of lust for a woman. And definitely this type of lechery that the porter describes is referring to a man. And so he's talking about lust in a man being provoked and unprovoked by drink. So he's saying that when you're drunk, you feel a great desire, but of course, when you're drunk, that takes away the ability to perform. And so it's a very crass, and I suppose it's supposed to be funny, part of the play, a bit of comedic relief that juxtaposes the horrible murder that's just taken place. It's interesting, the description of alcoholism here that the porter says, when he says it both makes him and it mars him, this is reflective of what Lady Macbeth said in the previous scene, where she says that what has quenched them hath made me fiery, or fire. So that's a similar description of alcohol. It can make or mar. It could quench or set you on fire. We'll go across now to page 66. We'll go down to line 41. Macbeth has entered at this point, and he says, "Not yet." And this is an emphasis on irony, because what has just happened, Macbeth asks, "Is the king stirring?" which means, has he woken? And Macbeth says, "Not yet," which is a dramatic understatement, because of course the king is dead. Underneath, when Macduff says timely, that means he was sent to call on early on the king, to wake him up early. Macduff is essentially acting like the king's alarm clock. If we look down at line 45, Macbeth says, "The labour we delight in physics pain." Physics here is linked to the word physician, and it means to treat or to medically treat pain. And below that, at line 48, Macduff says, "It is my limited service," which means it's been appointed to him. So it's his job to go into the king's chamber. We'll go to page 68, line 50. Lennox is speaking now to Macbeth. It's almost like an awkward exchange. Macbeth is standing there knowing 100% that Macduff's about to enter the chamber and find Duncan dead, and he has to make small talk with Lennox whilst that happens. And Lennox is telling him all about the night that's just gone. So the night when the king is murdered, a bunch of strange supernatural things take place all over Scotland. And Lennox says that there was such a strong wind, and the wind blew downward, that he says our chimneys were blown down. So that doesn't mean the chimneys were knocked over, but more so that the wind blew down the chimneys. And basically, he says that there were lamentings heard, that means cries, happening in the air, and there were strange screams of death. So basically, people heard screams all around. And then when he says the obscure bird, so this is line 54, clamoured the livelong night, that's referring to an owl, and the clamid there means making a noise or screeching, again linking to that idea of screaming, and also linking back to Lady Macbeth. When she was waiting for Macbeth to kill Duncan, she heard a scream and she couldn't tell whether or not it was an owl, or at least she told herself it was an owl when it could have possibly been one of the men that Macbeth killed. And then Lennox says, some say the earth was feverish and did shake, that's line 55 to 56, and that meant that there was an earthquake. So there's this idea of nature rebelling against this act. And then Macbeth says, 'twas a rough night, which has a double meaning. It both means, yes, the weather was rough, the screaming and the wind was rough, but also it was rough as in it was a violent night because there was a murder. Then we're going to look down at line 61 through to line 64 when Macduff comes back and he announces that King Duncan's been killed, and he does it in a very interesting way. He says, the Lord's anointed temple and stole thence the life of the building. So anointed temple, it could mean physically a temple that's been anointed, like a church. But it's also a biblical word for a body, and the king's body is anointed at their coronation. And so he basically says that the king's body, like a temple, has been broken into and stuff has been stolen from it. In this case, the life has been stolen from it. And that confuses everybody for a second until Lennox asks, do you mean the king? Mean you his majesty? We're going to turn to page 70 and we'll look at what Macduff says next. He says that he was met with a new gorgon. So a gorgon is the type of creature that Medusa from Greek mythology was. If you can remember back to studying Greek mythology in previous years, you might remember that Medusa was a woman who was said to have snakes for hair. And now the Gorgons of Greek mythology had a little bit more. They were said to have large tusks protruding from their mouth that meant that their tongues were always hanging out. And I think their tongues were black and they just were meant to look overall monstrous. And it was said that if you looked at them, you would be turned to stone. If you looked at Medusa, you would be turned to stone. So he basically says this site is like Medusa. This site is a new Gorgon. So if you go into the king's chamber and see his dead body, you will see a new Gorgon. That's what he's saying. And we'll continue on down to line 71. And at this point, Macduff is trying to wake everyone up. So he says, awake, awake, ring the alarm bell, murder and treason, and he calls for everyone to wake up. And he calls on line 71, sleep, death's counterfeit. So that means it's an imitation of death. And then he says the great doom's image. So they're talking about there, the great doom is another word for judgment day. So he's saying it is the end times. You need to not be asleep when it's the end times, or Armageddon, or whatever you would like to call that, the end of days. On line 75, he says the word to countenance this horror. Countenance there means to look upon or to face. So to face this horror. We'll continue on down. Lady Macbeth enters at this point, and we're looking at line 77. And she says, a hideous trumpet calls to parley. And that's a military meaning, and it's basically something that is announced by a trumpet. And that's where we'll leave it at that page, and we'll go across to page 72. So on page 72, I want you to go down to line 90. And Macbeth says, the wine of life is drawn, and the mere lees is left this vault to brag of. So basically, that is referring to dregs left in a wine cellar. So he's saying, now that the king is dead, the wine of his life, which could be associated with blood, red wine and red blood, has been drained out or poured out, and only dregs remain. So this also gives a visual of what the chamber itself would look like, whether or not Macbeth stabbed Duncan so much or cut a major artery. For whatever reason, his blood has drained out of his body and is everywhere, all over the chamber. We'll go across to page 74. On line 106, Macbeth says, "The expedition of my violent love," expedition there meaning haste or the quickness. He's talking about why he killed the guards. And we know the truth. The truth of killing the guards is because they plan to frame the guards for the murder, and so they need to keep them quiet. But Macbeth wants to hide that, again, that theme of appearance versus reality. And to link to that theme of appearance versus reality, he is using oxymorons. So he says, wise, amazed. Who can be wise, amazed? So to be wise, we think of someone who's reasonable and is thinking about things, whereas if you are amazed, you're probably emotional and more excessive. Temperate and furious. So temperate, again, someone who has reason, who has their emotions in check. If you're furious, you lack reason and you don't have your emotions in your control. Then he says loyal and neutral. So again, an oxymoron. The two words are contradicting. Loyal meaning that you are dedicated to someone, neutral meaning you're dedicated to no one. And he says that no man can be these two things at once. And then he says, the haste, so the expedition of my violent love outran me. So it made me too quick. And then he said he saw Duncan, his silver skin laced with his golden blood. And there we see again the idea that Lady Macbeth brought up in the previous scene of Duncan's blood being golden. So him being more than a mere mortal. And all of these things Macbeth uses to justify why he killed the guards. Now in line 110, he says, ruins wasteful entrance. Wasteful there means destructive. And then on line 112, he talks about their daggers. So this is the second mention of daggers, significant mention of daggers in this act. The first being when Macbeth sees the floating dagger, the second being this, when he's talking about the daggers unmannily breached with gore. And then the third time will actually be said by, it's either Malcolm or Donalbain, and I'll talk about that in the next page. And breached here means covered. If we continue down at line 16, when Malcolm is speaking, I would like you to highlight this line where Malcolm says that most may claim this argument for ours. And there he's saying and he's saying this to Donalbain, his brother, we should have the most to say. And so you could record that in your booklet as a quote to show the prince's reaction to their father's death. So at the moment they're being silenced, they're being pushed out, because part of this plan is orchestrated around blaming Malcolm and Donalbain as the reason to why the guards attacked their father. So making it look like they paid the guards to kill Duncan. And we'll follow on down below that. Donalbain says, where our fate hid in an auger hole there meaning a tiny hole made by a dagger, may rush and seize us. So they're saying that their fate, so them being blamed for their father's death, is hid in the stab wound. And then underneath that, the word brood is referring to their tears, and it's saying that they're ready to flow, but they're holding them back. Continuing, when Banquo is speaking, after Lady Macbeth is taken out after her fainting spell, he says, and when we had our naked frailties hid. So basically there he's bringing back his favorite imagery that he mentions again and again. That's the imagery of clothing. So when we are dressed. We'll turn to page 76. The very first line of that page, 125. The word scruples is used, and scruples there means doubts. We continue down to line 129. Macbeth says, let's briefly put on manly readiness. Briefly means quickly there. And then we have two important bits of information. Malcolm and Donalbain are left alone, and Malcolm says he'll go to England. Now, there's a lot to be said about this. Obviously, you need to think back to the context of this play. When and who was it written for? So it was written at the beginning of the 17th century, to the start of the 1600s, and it was written for England's new king, King James. He was the first of England and the sixth of Scotland, and it was very contentious to have a Scottish king on the throne of England. On top of that, King James was a very strange man. He was a strange king. He believed 100% in witchcraft and the supernatural. He had a different sensibility about how kings should be treated in their court. He believed that they were closer to God and therefore should be treated like a god by the people in their court, whereas England had been used to more of a democratic approach to things. Of course, it was still a monarchy, but they believed that courtiers and advisors had more of a say before this. And on top of that, Queen Elizabeth had gone a long way into funding Shakespeare's troupe and his plays, and they needed to secure the king's favour in order to keep that funding happening. And so, in many ways, this play is pandering to King James. In many ways, it's trying to please him, and it's also acting like a 17th century piece of propaganda, where they are intentionally rewriting history to make it look like England and Scotland have been friends or have worked together in the past, whereas in actual fact that's not true. So a quick rundown and a reminder of what actually happened in the 11th century. The king Macbeth had taken the throne not by murdering the previous king, but by killing Duncan in fair battle. Now, Macbeth was actually an excellent king by 11th century standards, and he was one of the first kings to unify both North and Southern Scotland, and he was basically seen as a good guy. Now, Malcolm III, Duncan's heir, did in fact go to England and asked for their help. That did happen in history. But unlike the heroic working together, the heroic cooperation that's portrayed in this play, Malcolm, with the help of England, came back into Scotland and killed a good king, Macbeth, and all of his family to ensure he would have no heirs. And so that's twisted around. We'll see later it's not Macbeth's family, because Macbeth doesn't have a family in this play, but Macduff's family that are killed. And they're not going to be killed by Malcolm, but they're going to be killed by Macbeth. Shakespeare's gone out of his way to make Macbeth appear the villain in order to make it look like Scotland and England working together is a good thing. And this would have been an interesting message to send to the public in this time to make them more accepting of a Scottish king. And also, it would have been an interesting message to send to the king himself to maybe endear England to him a little bit more. So there's some things to think about. And so it's interesting that Malcolm says he's going to England and Donalbain says he's going to Ireland. And then we see the very interesting line on line 136, and I'd like you to highlight this and record it because it's continuing that imagery of daggers. And this time Donalbain uses the word daggers metaphorically by saying there's daggers in men's smiles. So we know there's not literally daggers stuck in the mouths of the men around them, but that their smiles look deadly. They're hiding their true emotions underneath. So the men know that there was no reason for the guards to kill their father because they know that they themselves did not order them to, and so they know they are in danger and they decide to flee. So we'll look at some words here. In line 140, Malcolm says, let us not be dainty, not be being very formal. So he's saying, let's not be particular. And then underneath that, they say there's warrant in that theft, which warrant meaning justification. So there's a justification for them to leave.